All right, so meditation 3, God. I'm not going to talk to you today about anything actually in meditation 3. The reason why is I'm going to provide background for what Descartes has to say in meditation 3. The strategy here is going to be that Descartes will prove or try to prove that God exists. And once he has a proof that God exists, once he feels that he can be certain that God exists, basically he gets everything that was put under sort of epistemic threat by the evil demon argument, he gets those all back. Because, like, if God exists, then the evil demon doesn't, basically, or the evil demon is unable to trick you the way Descartes worried. And what Descartes is going to do is he's basically going to employ two of the three classic arguments for God's existence. The three classic arguments for God's existence are the teleological argument, which is sometimes called the design argument or argument from design, the cosmological argument, which is sometimes conflated with the first cause argument. The first cause argument is a type of cosmological argument. These are all actually best thought of as types of arguments. There's lots of different teleological arguments out there, and there's lots of different cosmological arguments out there. Every teleological argument is basically some version or other of a design argument, the idea being that we ought to conclude that the universe has been designed in some way, and so there needs to be a designer. The cosmological argument, not every version of it involves talking about the first cause. But I'll tell you about the first cause argument. Just know that whereas design is a fair characterization of every teleological argument, first cause is not a fair characterization of every cosmological argument. It's just the most famous version of the cosmological argument. The final version is the ontological argument, which doesn't go by any other name. Because very few people know about it. So it's famous within the fields of natural theology. It's famous within philosophy. It's not really famous elsewhere. If you've ever gotten into debates about God's existence with people on the internet, with like random ass people you meet on the internet, you're almost certainly encountered the cosmological or teleological arguments. You're very unlikely to have encountered the ontological argument because it's so weird and so hard to understand. The reason I'm going to tell you about these arguments, and the two kinds of arguments Descartes uses, are these two. He doesn't use the teleological argument, and he provides really bizarre versions of the cosmological and ontological argument. And the reason for this is the argumentative context he's in by the time he gets to Meditation 3. So remember, in Meditation 1, he laid out his skeptical arguments, the most powerful of which was the evil demon argument. In Meditation 2, he lays out the I think, therefore I am stuff, which is supposed to provide the foundation for rebuilding knowledge on solid foundations, on certain foundations. He thinks he can be certain that he exists and that all the contents of his mind exist too. Remember, just as ideas, not as actual things out in the world. So, by the time he gets to Meditation 3, the only thing he's certain of is that he and his ideas exist. But the only thing he's certain about when it comes to himself is that he has ideas, right? So he thinks there's ideas, and then there's something that has those ideas, and that's him. And what that means is there's a lot of evidence that's normally brought up in the teleological and cosmological arguments, which Descartes just can't use. So design arguments, for example, typically work the following way. You find some aspect of the natural world that works really, really well, right? That produces some good effect, and that it does so reliably, and it seems unlikely to have gotten that way by chance. Right? So for a long time, the way people would do this is they would take a look at the natural world, and they would take a look at the way animals behaved, and they would take a look at the way different parts of the natural world interacted with each other. So all the stuff you've ever heard about apparent cooperation among different species, everything you've ever heard about the way every natural process sort of feeds into and supports the other natural processes in that habitat, right? So, like a tree dies and falls, and the rotting wood provides a home for bugs and other animals and stuff like that. The bugs and other animals eat through the wood. Their excretions go into fertilizing the ground, into out of which a new tree of that same species grows. Right? That's kind of circle of life stuff. All that stuff. People would point to that stuff and they'd say, "Look how perfectly everything works." Right? Look how perfectly each animal seems for the environment in which you find it. Right? It seems like, cheetahs exist in the African safari and they don't exist in the mountains, the Rocky Mountains. Why? Well, it just seems like they're made for it. It seems like everything natural is perfectly made for the environment it's in. Now, all along, there would be people pointing out, like, there's actually a lot of things that could be a lot better made. Right? Like, human beings have a blind spot. Right? Every human being has some kind of blind spot. Because we have two eyes, they cover for each other, so you don't notice the blind spot. But you can go online and find the blind spot test and do it yourself, and you can see that, well, I guess not see, right? The blind spot. The appendix, right? Appendix is dumb. Right? It's an organ that at this point only exists to kill you. Once upon a time, maybe it helped you digest food. I don't know. That's what I read somewhere. But it does seem all along there was some evidence out there that, like, well, maybe things aren't designed as perfectly as we might like to think. But by and large, the preponderance of evidence was in favor of everything's working really well. Right? How did it get to work this way? And the idea was animals are too stupid to pull this off themselves. Plus, they lack the ability to change their own nature. But even when it just comes to animal behavior, like if you've ever seen, there's crocodiles that have birds that clean their teeth, and if the birds didn't clean their teeth, the crocodiles would suffer tooth decay. And there's nothing more pathetic than a toothless crocodile. But the crocodile just won't eat the bird, right? The bird that walks into its mouth to clean its teeth. And that seems like intelligent behavior, but crocodiles aren't intelligent. They're big dumb animals, right? So it always seemed like something must be guiding nature. Something must have set things up to work this way. What worked that way? Well, or what did that? What made the world work so perfectly? It would have to be an incredibly intelligent and powerful being, God. Right? Descartes can't use a teleological argument. A teleological argument, an argument by design, even if it doesn't focus on these kinds of biological examples, which it traditionally did. Descartes can't rely on them because Descartes at this point he can't talk about crocodiles, right? He can't say, now let's look at the crocodiles, because at this point he doesn't think he has any good basis for believing in crocodiles. He doesn't think he has any good basis for believing in trees. He doesn't think he has any good basis for believing in anything physical. And so the teleological argument for God's existence is out, given where in his argument he has to argue for God. Given that the only thing he can be sure of by the time he gets to the part of the argument where he wants to prove that God exists, the only thing he can be sure of is himself and his ideas. And just showing that, like, well, my ideas about crocodiles work really well with my ideas about that weird bird that walks into their mouth. There's an easy explanation for that. You invented cool ideas. Good job, right? So the teleological argument is out because Descartes can't appeal to the kind of evidence the teleological argument typically involves. The cosmological argument is a very different argument. So cosmological arguments are about the origins of the universe. So if you've ever heard about the discipline in physics, cosmology, that's a discipline that concerns itself with, like, the Big Bang, what happened right after the Big Bang, like inflations, right? Or the inflation of the universe, things like that. Maybe even stuff that happened before the Big Bang. Has to do with the origins of the universe. The cosmological argument is about that. The cosmological argument, the first cause argument, involves, and here I'll actually write this one out because Descartes gives a version of the cosmological argument, and it can be helpful to have sort of an original version and compare it to Descartes once we get to it. Cosmological argument starts with a premise like most things, or actually, no, I'll change it. All observed physical things have a cause. So for every observed thing, everything you observe, every physical thing that can be observed, every one of those things has a cause. Premise 2. Causal chains cannot be infinite. Basically this, take something you see, right? We'll call it A. A, if it's a physical thing, according to premise 1, it has a cause. Something made A exist. All right, so we'll call the cause of A B. But then you face a question, is B a physical thing or not? If B is a physical thing, kind of thing that can be observed, then according to 1, B has a cause. We'll call that C. And so on and so forth. Every time you identify the cause of something, you then have to ask, is it a physical cause or not? If it is a physical cause, then it itself must have a cause. So this is a causal chain. This sequence of things, one causing the other, causing the other, causing the other. This is a causal chain. Premise 2 says these things can't be infinitely long. If you're starting with A, right, it cannot be the case that this goes on forever backwards. It's ruled out. It can also not be the case that it goes in a circle. And if you're noticing a similarity here between this argument and another argument we read in Aristotle, the regress argument for foundationalism, for the view that there must be some foundational beliefs that weren't inferred from any others, you should be. It's an argument of a very similar structure. Premises 2 and premises 3 in this argument correspond to premises that are basically exactly the same in the regress argument, except for there they weren't causal chains, they were chains of justification, where one belief was justified by another belief, which was justified by another belief. The idea is there can't be infinitely long chains, and the chains can't be circular. The non-circularity argument is pretty straightforward here. If D caused A, or if A caused D, rather, then what you would have is A causing D, D causing C, C causing B, B causing A. So A would have caused itself, and for A to cause something, it would have to happen before the thing that it causes. So that would mean A happened before A happened, and Aristotle's like, well, that's a contradiction. That can't be true. The causal chains can't go on forever thing is just Aristotle's hostility, once again, to the idea of an actually existing infinite collection. Right? At any given moment in time, any collection of things has to be finite. Right? Even if they keep getting bigger, and so in a sense the series is infinite, Aristotle says at any particular point it's not yet infinite. Okay, so what this means is if the chains don't go backwards for infinity, and if they aren't circular, then at some point they just stop. How can they stop? Right? How can you stop the chain from going on forever backwards? Well, what comes after F? G. G for God. Right? Now, how is it that you can stop at G? If you couldn't stop at B, C, D, E, or F, why can you stop at G? Well, actually, you could have stopped at B, C, D, E, or F. I didn't because I wanted to get it to G. G for God. That's funny. Right? I hope so. Anyway, you could have at any point. All you had to do was say, for B, let's say, if you say, all right, I've got A is an observed physical object, so by premise 1, A must have a cause, and the cause is B. Remember, I then said, well, is B a physical thing? If the answer was yes, then B needed to be caused by C. If the answer was no, premise 1 is no longer operative. Premise 1 would not imply anything. So once you get to a non-physical thing, right, the kind of thing that can't be observed, then the chain stops. And the idea of this argument is, so we'll say, I have a premise here. So there must be a first cause. The idea is 4 follows from 2 and 3. And the first cause is God. Why is it God? Well, because G stands for God. The idea was supposed to be that if it's the thing from which the universe begins, if it's the thing that caused everything else in the universe, and if it's not a physical thing, if it's beyond the ability of our senses to tell us about, then it's plausible that it's God. There are more premises you need in here. For example, it seems perfectly possible to have the following situation. So you have H, which is caused by I, which is caused by J and K and L, right? N. You could have a situation where the chain for H goes through I, J, K, L, M, N, and then just stops with N. Right? And where N is a different thing than G. That seems possible. In which case, you might not have one first cause. You might have multiple first causes for different originating cause for each causal chain. Typically, these arguments rely either explicitly or implicitly on some kind of simplicity assumption, right? So if you have to choose between more than one first cause and one first cause, you should just go with one first cause. It leads to a simpler worldview. But that's the first cause argument. I want to point something out here, because there are few things that you encounter in philosophy class more discussed on the internet, more discussed by intellectual charlatans in silly books than the first cause argument. The first cause argument, some people treat it as way more powerful an argument than it actually is. So there are some people who are just like, this obviously proves that God exists. Pfft, anybody who doubts it is a moron. There's all sorts of problems with the first cause argument. However, there is one problem that is very commonly attributed to the first cause argument, which just simply isn't a problem whatsoever. The accusation is often made about the first cause argument that contradicts itself. It says there's a first cause, but everything is caused. So if everything has a cause, there can't be a first cause. Well, as you might have noticed, I didn't say everything was caused in premise one. I said all observed physical things have a cause. And you might have thought, well, that was cheating. No, this is how every major version of the first cause argument was always put forward. The version of the argument that gets criticized, especially online, especially by people online who like to pretend that they're super dope, is they'll state the argument this way. Everything has a cause, and then all the rest of it too, like causal chains can't be infinite, causal chains can't be circular, so there must be a first cause, and then they'll say, aha, that's a contradiction. The thing to realize is the only people who ever make this, the first premise of the first cause argument, are people who are trying to show that it's a stupid argument. No major thinker in the history of thought ever fell into that easy a trap. So if you ever come across anyone saying the first cause argument contradicts itself, just know that this person doesn't actually know what they're talking about. If you found yourself saying this in the past, then congratulations, you now know something you didn't. The first cause argument, no good version of the first cause argument, no historically important version of the first cause argument has ever had as an initial premise, everything has a cause. Right? And just as a general rule of thumb, anytime you come across somebody saying a very famous argument that many brilliant people have believed in can be easily shown to be false, almost always that person is wrong. Almost always that person has not understood the argument. I myself do not accept the first cause argument. I think it does not prove its conclusion that God exists. I don't even think it proves its conclusion that there is a first cause, right? So you might say, well, maybe you don't believe that the first cause is God, but you got to at least believe in 4. I don't even believe in 4. That said, it is not easy to show what the problem with the first cause argument is. Anyone who tells you it is easy doesn't know what they're talking about. All right, we are now about 20 minutes into this video. And I've talked about now 2 kinds of arguments, the 2 most famous kinds of arguments, the teleological argument and the cosmological argument. The version of the cosmological argument that Descartes' going to use can't quite be the version I've presented. Why? Well, I was talking about observed physical objects. Descartes doesn't think he's in any position to talk about observed physical objects or things. He doesn't see himself as having any reason to believe that such things exist. So he's going to have to talk about something different. And what he's basically going to talk about are his own ideas. But it's going to complicate things, and it's going to make the argument a lot less straightforward, and it's going to mean he has to appeal to premises that are less plausible than the premises I've just presented. That's what's going to happen in Meditation 3. In Meditation 5, he's going to give a version of the ontological argument. He's going to give two separate arguments for God in this work. I like to think that the reason why is that he realized that the argument in Meditation 3 isn't good. And so he's like, well, here's another one in case that one didn't convince you. I don't know whether that's true, but I find the argument in Meditation 3 for God's existence bad enough that it's really good he has another one. That other one is a version, like I said, of the ontological argument. It is not all that different than the traditional presentation of the ontological argument. The ontological argument was first presented by a guy named Saint Anselm of Canterbury in between like 1000 and 1100 AD in England, although I think he was actually living in Paris when he came up with it. The teleological arguments and cosmological arguments, by the way, both come from Plato and Aristotle. The teleological argument is definitely in Plato. I've read people who say the cosmological argument can also be found in Plato, just not really well developed. Both arguments received a fuller discussion and development from Aristotle, especially the cosmological argument. The argument in the form I just presented it to you about causation is basically straight from Aristotle. He can't use those, though. He can't use those in the form that they're traditionally presented. He can't use the teleological argument at all, Descartes. He can't use the cosmological argument the way it's traditionally presented. He is, however, going to be able to use the ontological argument exactly as it was originally used, or almost exactly as it was originally used. When we get to Meditation 5, which is where he presents the ontological argument, I'll tell you a little something about the original version of the argument, because even in that case, the original version is better than what Descartes presents. But for now, I wanted to give you some of the background for what's going on in Meditation 3. Because I think if you know this simpler version, and just take my word for it, this argument that I presented is simpler than the argument Descartes himself is going to present. If you understand this simpler argument, you're in a better position to understand the more complicated, less plausible argument that he's actually going to present you in Meditation 3.